My uncle stole my inheritance and left me drowning in debt. But when I discovered the truth about what he'd done with my father's construction company, I realized his greed had cost him far more than money. After 17 years of lies, manipulation, and watching him destroy everything my father built, I finally had the ammunition I needed. What he didn't know was that his betrayal would unravel secrets that would destroy not just him, but everything he held dear. I am Victoria Sterling, a 34-year-old forensic accountant in Denver, Colorado. For the past decade, I've built a reputation tracking financial fraud for major corporations, but nothing prepared me for discovering that the biggest fraud of my life was happening in my own family. When my father died 5 years ago, he left me his construction business, Sterling and Sons Construction, a company he'd spent 30 years building from nothing. At least that's what I thought he left me. The morning I discovered the truth started, like any other Tuesday. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my downtown office when my phone rang. It was Janet Morrison from First National Bank, and her voice carried that particular tone that accountants learned to dread. "Victoria, I'm calling about your father's business account. We need to discuss some irregularities in the loan documentation." My blood went cold. There shouldn't have been any loan documentation. According to the will, Sterling and Sons was mine, free and clear. My father had been meticulous about keeping the business debt-free, something he'd drilled into me since I was old enough to understand what a balance sheet meant. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked, already pulling up my laptop to access the business accounts I'd inherited. "Well, it appears there was a significant loan taken against the business assets just 6 months before your father's death. The collateral was the entire company, equipment, contracts, real estate, everything. And according to our records, the loan is currently in default." The words hit me like a physical blow. Default meant foreclosure. Foreclosure meant losing everything my father had worked for, everything he'd intended to leave me. But who had taken out the loan? I was the only heir, the only one with legal authority over the business. "Janet, can you tell me who signed for this loan?" "Of course. The signatory is listed as Thomas Sterling, authorized by power of attorney. Documentation dated 3 months before the loan was executed. Thomas Sterling, my Uncle Tom. My father's younger brother, the man who'd stood beside me at the funeral, who'd helped me navigate the early days of grief, who'd offered to help manage the business transition while I got my bearings. The man I'd trusted completely." The phone slipped from my numb fingers as the truth crashed over me. Uncle Tom hadn't been helping me. He'd been systematically destroying everything my father had built, and he'd been doing it with my unwitting permission. I'd signed documents he'd brought me, trusting his explanations about transitional paperwork and estate requirements. I'd never bothered to read them carefully because he was family, because I trusted him. That afternoon, I drove to the Sterling and Sons office for the first time in months. The small building that housed my father's legacy sat on the outskirts of Denver, surrounded by equipment yards and the half-finished skeleton of what should have been our biggest contract yet, a luxury housing development that would have set the company up for years. But as I walked through the front door, I knew something was wrong immediately. The office was nearly empty. The drafting tables where my father's engineers had worked were gone. The project boards that had lined the walls were missing. Even the family photos that had sat on the reception desk, pictures of my father receiving various industry awards, images of completed projects he'd been proud of, had vanished. "Can I help you?" The voice belonged to a woman I didn't recognize, someone young and efficiently dressed who looked at me like I was an intruder. "I'm Victoria Sterling. This is my company." Her expression shifted to something between confusion and pity. "Oh, I'm sorry, but Mr. Sterling," Tom Sterling, said the ownership transition was complete. "Are you here about the final asset liquidation?" Asset liquidation. The words felt like ice in my veins. What asset liquidation? "The equipment sale is scheduled for Friday. Most of the office contents have already been moved to storage or sold." Mr. Sterling said the family had decided to dissolve the company rather than continue operations. I stood there in the gutted office that had been my inheritance, surrounded by the ghosts of my father's dreams, and finally understood the full scope of Tom's betrayal. He hadn't just stolen the company. He'd been systematically dismantling it, selling off pieces while I remained oblivious. The man I'd turned to for guidance in my grief had been using that grief against me. manipulating my trust to rob me of everything my father had wanted me to have. That evening, I sat in my apartment with every document Tom had ever brought me, spread across my dining room table. With my forensic accounting skills finally applied to my own situation, the pattern became clear and devastating. The power of attorney I'd signed, thinking it was temporary help with estate management, had actually given Tom complete control over the business. The loan documents I'd initialed, believing they were refinancing paperwork to improve cash flow, were actually secured debt against every asset the company owned. But the worst discovery came when I traced the loan proceeds. The money hadn't gone into business operations or even Tom's personal accounts. It had been funneled through a shell company, Sterling Development LLC, that Tom had created without my knowledge. And Sterling Development had been purchasing real estate, including the very land that Sterling & Sons had been contracted to develop. Tom hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He'd used it to bid against his own company, driving Sterling & Sons into bankruptcy while positioning himself to acquire the development rights at a fraction of their value. It was fraud on a scale that should have impressed me professionally if it hadn't been destroying my life personally. The next morning I called Tom. I needed to understand why. Maybe some part of me still hoped there was an explanation, some misunderstanding that could make this betrayal make sense. "Victoria, how are you, honey? I was just thinking about you." His voice carried that same warm, avuncular tone that had comforted me at my father's funeral, the same tone that had convinced me to sign away my future. "I need to ask you about some documents, Uncle Tom, about the business." There was a pause, just long enough for me to hear the shift in his breathing. "What kind of documents?" "The loan, the power of attorney, Sterling Development LLC," I let each phrase hang in the air between us like an accusation. "Victoria, sweetheart, I think there might be some confusion. Why don't you come over for dinner this weekend and we can talk through everything? Your Aunt Carol would love to see you and—" "The bank called, Tom." I cut through his deflection with surgical precision. "They want their money, $750,000 plus interest and penalties. The loan you took against my father's company is in default, and they're going to foreclose on everything unless I can come up with the payment." The silence stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the warm uncle. In his place was someone I'd never heard before, someone cold and calculating. "Your father's company was failing, Victoria. You never bothered to look at the books, never showed any interest in actually running the business. I saved what I could. You saved it for yourself. I saved it from your incompetence. Do you have any idea what it takes to run a construction company? The permits, the regulations, the constant cash flow problems? Your father spent 30 years building something, and you would have destroyed it in 6 months." The casual cruelty of his words was almost more shocking than the financial betrayal. This wasn't desperation or poor judgment. This was calculated malice, wrapped in a justification that somehow made me the villain in my own robbery. "So you decided to steal it. Instead?" "I decided to preserve it. Sterling Development will honor your father's legacy better than you ever could." The line went dead, and I sat staring at my phone, finally understanding that the uncle who had held me while I cried at my father's funeral had never existed. The man who had stolen my inheritance was a stranger who happened to share my blood, someone capable of using my grief as a weapon against me. But Tom had made one critical mistake in his assessment of me. He thought I was just another grieving daughter, too overwhelmed to pay attention to details. He didn't realize that forensic accounting had taught me to see patterns in chaos, to trace money through the most complex schemes, and to build cases that could withstand legal scrutiny. He'd robbed the wrong person. Over the next 2 weeks, I built a case against my uncle that was meticulous and devastating. I traced every transaction, documented every forged signature, and mapped the entire structure of his fraud. The power of attorney he'd used was invalid. The notarization was backdated, and the witness signatures belonged to people who could prove they were out of state on the date the document was supposedly signed. The loan itself was fraudulent, secured with documentation that Tom had no legal authority to execute. But more than that, I discovered the full scope of his betrayal extended far beyond just stealing from me. Tom had been embezzling from Sterling & Sons for years, skimming money from contracts and inflating material costs to hide the theft. My father had died never knowing that his trusted brother had been robbing him, never understanding why the company's profits had been mysteriously declining despite successful projects. The hardest part wasn't building the case, it was deciding what to do with it. Tom wasn't just some anonymous criminal. He was family. He was the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had come to every birthday party of my childhood, who had been my father's best man and business partner. Destroying him would also destroy my Aunt Carol, my cousins, and the extended family relationships that connected us all. But then I found the final piece that crystallized my resolve. Hidden in Tom's files was a letter dated 3 days after my father's funeral. It was addressed to a business competitor, offering to sell them Sterling & Sons client list and ongoing contracts at a steep discount. The letter was never sent, probably because Tom realized he could make more money by executing the elaborate fraud instead. But it showed his intent, his complete willingness to dismember everything my father had built for his own profit. At the bottom of the letter, in Tom's handwriting, was a note that made my decision for me. Michael never understood the real value of what he built. His daughter understands even less. Time to put this company in competent hands. That night, I made copies of everything and drove to the FBI field office in Denver. White-collar crime wasn't just my profession. It was a federal offense, and Tom's scheme had crossed enough jurisdictional lines to make it their problem. I walked into their offices with 3 binders of evidence and a complete financial reconstruction of the fraud, laid out with the kind of methodical precision that had made my reputation. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez listened to my presentation, with the focused attention of someone who had seen plenty of financial crimes, but recognized something particularly egregious. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me. "This is incredibly thorough work, Ms. Sterling. How long have you been building this case?" 2 weeks of focused investigation, but really, he's been building it himself for 3 years. I just had to connect the pieces. And you understand that pursuing this will likely result in criminal charges against your uncle? Fraud of this magnitude carries serious federal penalties. I thought about my father, about the 30 years he'd spent building something meaningful, about the trust he'd placed in his brother, about the legacy he'd intended to leave me. I understand. There's one more thing. Given the complexity of this fraud and your expertise in forensic accounting, we'd like you to consult on the investigation. Would you be willing to help us build the criminal case? The irony wasn't lost on me. Tom's betrayal had positioned me to become the architect of his destruction, using the very skills that had made me successful to ensure his downfall. Yes, I'll help you build the case. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed. Within a month, agents had executed search warrants on Tom's home, his Sterling development offices, and every bank account connected to the scheme. They'd frozen his assets, including the development properties he'd acquired with my father's money, and begun the process of unwinding the fraud. But the hardest part came when I had to face the family. Aunt Carol called me 3 days after the FBI raids, her voice broken and confused. "Victoria, honey, can you tell me what's happening? The agents won't explain anything, and Tom says this is all some kind of misunderstanding." I'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times, but hearing the pain in her voice made every prepared word feel inadequate. "Aunt Carol, Tom stole my inheritance. He defrauded the bank and embezzled from the company. The FBI has evidence of everything. But why would you... couldn't you have talked to him first? Worked something out as a family?" The question cut deep because part of me had wondered the same thing. Could I have confronted Tom privately? Demanded restitution, found some way to handle this without destroying the family? But then I remembered the contempt in his voice when he'd called me incompetent, the calculated way he'd used my grief against me, the years of theft from my father who had trusted him completely. He had 3 years to make this right, Carol. Every day he chose to continue the fraud instead of coming clean was another day he chose money over family. But the criminal charges? Victoria, he could go to prison. What about his children? What about our family? I closed my eyes and tried to find words that could bridge the gap between justice and compassion. "I'm sorry, Carol. I'm so sorry this is hurting you and the kids. But I couldn't let him get away with stealing everything Dad built. And I couldn't let him think that family loyalty means I'll let myself be robbed blind." The conversation ended with both of us crying, and I knew it was probably the last real conversation I'd ever have with that side of my family. Tom's children, my cousins who had been like siblings growing up, stopped taking my calls. Extended family members chose sides, and most of them chose Tom, seeing me as the vindictive niece who had destroyed their family rather than the victim seeking justice. But as the criminal case progressed, more victims emerged. The FBI investigation uncovered other fraudulent schemes Tom had been running, including contractor fraud that had cheated other small businesses and tax evasion that had been going on for years. I wasn't his only victim, I was just the one, with the skills and resources to fight back. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and I testified for an entire day about the financial structure of the fraud. Tom sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit that had probably been paid for with stolen money, occasionally looking at me with an expression that mixed hurt and fury, as if I had betrayed him by refusing to let his betrayal stand. His defense attorney tried to paint me as a greedy niece who had misunderstood legitimate business decisions, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, shell companies, and a paper trail that told the story of systematic theft more clearly than any testimony could. When the jury read the guilty verdict on all 17 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, but exhaustion. The man who had been my second father was going to federal prison, and I had put him there. Justice had been served, but the cost had been everything that remained of our family. Tom received 8 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay full restitution plus penalties, nearly $2 million that would come from the liquidation of everything he'd stolen. Sterling & Sons would be restored to me, along with the development properties and equipment he'd acquired through fraud. Financially, I would recover everything and more. But sitting in the courtroom as he was led away, in handcuffs, I realized that some things couldn't be recovered. The uncle who had been part of my childhood was gone, revealed to be an illusion built over years of carefully hidden greed. The extended family relationships that had given me a sense of belonging were severed, probably permanently. The trust that had made me vulnerable to his manipulation was destroyed, replaced by a wariness that would color every future relationship. In the months that followed, I rebuilt Sterling & Sons with a determination that bordered on obsession. I hired back the employees Tom had laid off, reacquired the contracts he'd canceled, and threw myself into honoring my father's legacy in a way I'd never done when I'd simply inherited it. The company became not just my livelihood, but my mission, a monument to the idea that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight destroyed everything else. But the real resolution came almost a year later, in an unexpected phone call from my youngest cousin, Sarah. She was Tom's daughter, barely 22, and she'd been one of the family members who'd cut me off completely after the trial. Victoria? It's Sarah. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I found some of Dad's old papers when Mom was cleaning out the storage unit. I found letters he wrote but never sent, and I understand now. What he did to you, what he did to Uncle Michael. I'm sorry I blamed you. I sat in my office at Sterling & Sons, surrounded by the architectural drawings for 3 new housing developments and photos of my father receiving industry awards that I'd restored to their place of honor, and tried to find words for the complicated mixture of grief and relief her call represented. Sarah, you don't need to apologize. You were protecting your father. I understand that. But he was wrong. And the things he wrote about you, about Uncle Michael, they were awful. He convinced himself that he deserved what he stole, that you didn't understand business, that Uncle Michael had somehow cheated him over the years. But reading his words, I could see how he'd twisted everything to justify what he'd done. What will you do now? I'm finishing college with the money from the restitution settlement. Mom and I are moving to Phoenix to start over. And Victoria, when I graduate, if you'd ever consider it, I'd like to learn about the business. The real family business. The one great Uncle Michael built. I looked at the framed photo on my desk. My father in his hard hat at a construction site, grinning with the satisfaction of a man who built things that lasted. I'd like that, Sarah. I'd like that very much. After we hung up, I walked through the office that had been gutted by betrayal and rebuilt through determination. The betrayal had cost me an uncle, a surrogate father, and most of my extended family. It had taught me that blood relationships could mask the deepest kind of selfishness, and that trust, once broken, left scars that never fully healed. But it had also taught me something else, that justice wasn't about revenge or punishment, though both had played their roles. Justice was about refusing to let someone else's greed define the limits of your own integrity. It was about fighting for what mattered, even when the fight was harder than surrender would have been. Tom had been right about one thing. I'd never understood the real value of what my father had built. But it wasn't the financial value he'd been referring to. The real value was in the principles, that work mattered, that promises should be kept, that trust was something to be honored rather than exploited. Tom had tried to steal those principles along with everything else, but he'd failed. They were mine now, not because I'd inherited them, but because I'd chosen to defend them. Standing in the office my father had built and my uncle had tried to destroy, I finally understood what my father had really left me. Not just a business, but a choice. To be someone who built things or someone who tore them down. Someone who honored trust or someone who exploited it. Someone who chose family loyalty or family justice when the two came into conflict. Tom had made his choice years ago, every time he'd forged a signature or transferred money that wasn't his. I'd made mine in the FBI field office with 3 binders of evidence, and then again every day since as I worked to rebuild what he'd tried to take. The betrayal had changed me, hardened me in some ways, and clarified others. I would never again sign a document without reading every word, never again trust someone's explanation of complex financial arrangements, never again assume that shared blood meant shared values. But I would also never again doubt my ability to fight for what mattered. Never again let someone else's assessment of my capabilities define my own limitations. In the end, Tom's greatest miscalculation wasn't underestimating my skills as a forensic accountant. It was underestimating my willingness to value justice over family harmony. He'd thought that blood would make me complicit in my own robbery, that grief would make me pliable, that love would make me weak. He'd been wrong about all of it. Blood without honor was just biology. Grief without justice was just surrender. And love without boundaries was just another word for enabling someone else's cruelty. I was Victoria Sterling, daughter of Michael Sterling, heir to something more valuable than money or property or family connections. I was the woman who had chosen justice over comfort, truth over harmony, and principle over peace. Tom's betrayal had been designed to destroy me, but instead it had revealed who I really was underneath the grief and trust and naive family loyalty. The price of blood, it turned out, was everything Tom had thought he was stealing. But the value of integrity was something he'd never understood and could never take away.